everyone. My name is Susan Jennings. I'm Executive Director of the Arthur Morgan Institute for Community Solutions, and I'm here with Megan Bachman, who is the editor of the Yellow Springs News, and Lela Klein, who is the co-executive director of CoOp Dayton. And we're really excited to be in conversation with Lela. This is part of a series that the Yellow Springs News and Community Solutions are doing to talk about the economic and social and community opportunities available to us as a community in Yellow Springs, and maybe more broadly than Yellow Springs. All those opportunities that have kind of been unearthed in an unexpected way through the shutdowns over the last year. Right now, we are in February of 2021, so we're coming up on a year in a couple weeks of the shutdown. So really looking forward to talking to Lela about some of the possibilities that she sees have opened up. Lela is, and many of you will know Lela because she has a lot of Yellow Springs roots. She's the executive director of CoOp Dayton, where she facilitates the development of worker-owned cooperatives to create good jobs and fill community needs. Prior to this role, she worked as a union-side labor and employment attorney for 7 years. She's a native Daytonian, and she got her BA from Cornell and her JD from Harvard, which I have to say. So welcome, Lela. Really, really glad to have you here. And Megan, would you like to get started with a conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for coming, Lela. You're hearing about your background, kind of makes sense how you came into the cooperative world, but I guess I would love to hear more like how you came upon this model and, what it really is, how you really break it down, and why is this, you think, kind of fundamental to how we restructure our economies?
Well, it's a great question. And I spent most of my kind of early career in the labor movement, first as an organizer and then later as an attorney, working primarily for unions, but also in working people's movements generally. And I think what drew me to the labor movement was the idea of collective strength and the idea that, we have more power when we stand together, when our interests align. And when we can find the places where we can, kind of knit together our struggles. And then also the idea of solidarity, the idea that none of us can thrive when others are not thriving. And I grew up in Dayton, and then also in Yellow Springs, and really watched our economy change in my kind of teens and 20s, and then moving home to the region in my 30s. And, I came back as a labor lawyer, but pretty early on was invited to participate in some movement work here in the area, including doing legal observing for some of the John Crawford protests. And then later, through some connections that I had made in that work, was invited to a conversation about Dayton's, what we call either, food desert, or some people term food apartheid to indicate that it is a product of intentional policy rather than a naturally occurring event. So I was invited to the table by activists as sort of a participant, and I was doing it as a volunteer in addition to my work as a labor lawyer. And then over time, I found myself just being really pulled down the cooperative rabbit hole, learning more and more about the ways in which communities throughout time, and certainly in US history, have used cooperatives to create more resilient local economies, particularly inspired by a model in Spain called Madrigal, and then the history of African-American co-ops in this country. And then in the end, it was ironic because I hadn't thought of this at the beginning, but what I realized once I had left my lawyer job and become a full-time co-op developer, was that I grew up with parents who had formed a cooperative film distribution company in the 70s. So I grew up around co-ops and just sort of hadn't really landed for me. So that's my background and how I got into the cooperative world.
Thanks for that. It seems like cooperatives are a natural fit for our area, but what do you see as the barriers for cooperatives growing in membership and impact and in development in general in our area and in the US?
I think that, kind of mindset changes are one barrier. I think when some people think of a cooperative, they think of a small natural food store, or they might think of an agricultural cooperative. But I think I read a statistic that 90% of business schools don't mention cooperatives at all in their curriculum. It's just a very underused business model in this country. We only have, several hundred worker cooperatives in the United States, which is, it's truly, it's a missed opportunity. On the other hand, in this country, when, for example, most of the country was not electrified and only cities had electric power, and it didn't make business sense for privately held electric companies to go into rural areas. Rural Electric actually electrified 75% of this country, and that was all a cooperative, Rural Electric. So we don't immediately think of cooperatives. I think we have a mindset of like a single entrepreneur who's gonna, put their own, they're mortgage their home to, start their business, and then they're gonna do or die kind of alone, in the free market, and see if things work or not. Or we also, I think, tend to kind of miss cooperative opportunities because we see solutions that need to be solved, and we immediately turn to sort of, oh, is there a grant funded solution to this, or is there a nonprofit solution, rather than, how can we look at social entrepreneurship or impact entrepreneurship. So I think that's it. It's like it's an underutilized and an underknown mechanism. And then the other big challenge is an access to capital challenge, which creative minds all over the country are trying to fix. But many kind of traditional banks don't really yet kind of know how to underwrite a cooperative. They're really looking for that single owner who they can underwrite, and it's harder to sort of look at a collective and say, like, how do we, who's accountable if this business fails? But it's doable. And for example, CDFIs, community development financial institutions all over the country, have started lending practices that really can be applied to co-ops. And even the Small Business Administration, the SBA, has actually started really looking at how to assist banks in understanding how to finance new cooperatives. But that access to capital is really a barrier, because you can't just walk into a traditional bank at this point and get the kind of financing you need to start a business. You've got to be more creative.
Interesting. It sounds like there's the kind of the mental, the cultural, what we know about, what we understand, and then also some of these physical barriers. I guess I'm wondering if you could kind of point to some examples of what it really looks like. As you said, you think of a food co-op, but like, what does it really look like to have like an ecosystem of cooperatives? I wondered if you could point out some examples of what that kind of entails.
Sure. I think the most inspiring example is in the Basque region of Spain, a small city called Mondragon, that through the 1950s and 60s built a network of interconnected co-ops. Starting in the wake of the Spanish Civil War, when the community had very high poverty levels, it was war-torn. There wasn't a lot of economic development activity. A Catholic priest and a group of graduates from a polytechnic institute came together and formed a kerosene stove manufacturing cooperative, and in 1956. And then by 20 years later, they had created enough cooperatives that there was full employment in the region. So I mean, it's like a powerful, resilient model. And I think, it really is, you mentioned an ecosystem, it is a full ecosystem. They have a cooperative bank and a cooperative university, and they have cooperatively owned, research and development labs. They're working in AI. They have 70,000 employees of their cooperatives, made 12 billion euros in revenue. I think it was like last year or the year before. So that to me is like, that's the gold standard. That's inspiring. What if Dayton, or the Dayton region, was the Mondragon of the United States? But even here in the United States, there's a great co-op ecosystem developing in New York City, because New York City government has really started to invest in cooperative development in a very purposeful way. And same thing with the Bay Area, where you see, just co-ops popping up all of the time. And there's, it's really a hotbed of cooperative development. In both cases, it's been a combination of, organizers, activists, business leaders, and then also city government actually making a intentional investment in co-op development. So it kind of takes both.
So
Okay.
Lela, I wonder actually in terms of food cooperatives, if you know very much about the Cleveland, the Evergreen Cooperative, and if you think I mean, your signature project right now, which we'd love you to talk about because so much exciting is happening around Gem City Market. We'd love to hear about that. But as you know, as we're moving down from the international to national to local, if you do think there's an opportunity for something like the Evergreen Cooperatives, which are, you know, maybe the closest ecosystem to our area, if you think there's an opportunity for something like that in our region.
I mean, I think the Evergreen model is really inspiring. For folks who don't know, Evergreen in Cleveland is really focused on what's called the anchor model of cooperative. So the idea is you sort of develop a plan for what the big anchor institutions in a city are going to be doing in terms of purchasing and procurement, and then build cooperatives that can actually sit in their supply chain. So you have a built-in mechanism you have a built-in customer base. And so as an example, Evergreen has a cooperative laundromat or commercial laundry that does the linens, I believe, for the Cleveland Clinic and I think Case Western as well. And that cooperative, it's a worker-owned cooperative that is owned by workers who live in the communities immediately around the hospital, which had been, divested, and there was, there was this, it was like that ivory tower phenomenon where the hospital had a ton of wealth, but the communities around it didn't. And so this was an idea to, build more community wealth in those neighborhoods. I think it's a great model. We met with folks at Evergreen and have visited Cleveland to try to sort of evaluate that model for Dayton or for the Dayton region. I mean, I do think we always have to be looking at anchor purchasing as a real mechanism to move the needle. I think it's a little more challenging in a city like Dayton, where many of our kind of traditional anchors, our Fortune 500s, have all left, and there's not as many anchors left, and the anchors that we do have are smaller than the anchors in Cleveland. However, we know, there's two major hospital systems, there's several universities, all of them do, millions of dollars of procurement, and all of them have sort of that nonprofit mission-based kind of mentality. And so if we could create the kinds of businesses that could sit in their supply chain, that would be really excellent. It hasn't been a focus of ours, honestly, because many of our co-ops, we really focus on two things. One is building worker co-ops, and you said this in the intro, Susan, building worker co-ops, but also building worker co-ops that meet needs in the community. And so a lot of our co-op ideas are driven by, like, what are the gaps in the market? So as an example, there's no full service grocery store serving 40,000 people on the west and northwest side of Dayton. That's a huge market gap. No traditional market actor wanted to come in and serve those folks. But people need to have access to fresh, fruits and vegetables for us to be a resilient city. So we built a cooperative that kind of sits in that gap. And then similarly, we know there's a huge infant mortality crisis in the Dayton area that's absolutely racially stratified and really shameful. So we actually have a group of doulas and other perinatal health providers who are coming together to form a cooperative to sort of sit in that gap. So that's really, I think it's somewhat philosophical. Like, do you create co-ops that are driven by anchor need, or do you create co-ops that are driven by community need, or can you do both? But I think it's an interesting conversation to have, and we're always excited to work with partners. So if anchors want to work with us, we would love to do so.
Yeah, I guess I would love to hear more about, like, Gem City and where you are, and like how you envision Gem City as maybe helping to create additional cooperatives or kind of grow the movement in Dayton.
We're at this very exciting precipice where we've spent the past 5.5 years building a membership base of over 3,000 member owners in the community. So I should say the Gem City market is both worker and community owned. We don't have workers yet, or we only have a few right now. And so it's primarily community owned at this point, but the members, the workers will have a chance to be member owners once they've been employed for 6 to 12 months, depending on how much they work. And so, 5 years to, raise some philanthropic dollars for the building, organize over 3,000. I think we're coming up on 3,500 people as the community owners, develop partnerships with both kind of service providers and healthcare organizations, but also wholesalers and farmers. And we are, we're right at the edge. We're like, by the time you play this, we might even already be open. We don't have a date yet, but we're weeks away from opening our doors to the public as a full service cooperative grocery store on Salem Avenue in Northwest Dayton. And I've always seen the Gem City market as sort of a way to build people's knowledge of co-ops. I think a lot of people in Dayton first heard of co-ops when the Fifth Street Brew Pub opened, which is a neighborhood-owned, cooperatively owned brew pub in the St. Anne's neighborhood. And people started thinking about co-ops. And it was helpful to us when we first got started because people had seen this very successful co-op enterprise open. But the more people know, the more people can see the Gem City market and can say, okay, this is a way in which thousands of community members came together to solve their own, to meet their own needs, using their own assets and talents. It's sort of a learning laboratory of cooperatives. So that's, I think, going to be powerful. And then we're also really interested in other food-based enterprises that want to develop, co-op or not. We want to work with local food-based enterprises to stock their food on our shelves. And so we do actually have 3 other kind of smaller food-based projects that we're helping to incubate that will have some relationship to the Gem City market.
Wonderful. Now, Lela, I heard you say you were a co-executive director. So I'm curious, it sounds like you're practicing what you preach. I'd be curious about, how you instill some of those values, and just following up on what you were talking about, like how you work with the communities. It sounds like that's important, not like coming in and solving problems for other people.
Yeah, I think it's so important to practice what you preach, and we want to model that kind of cooperative mentality. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, so as Co-op Dayton, we couldn't, we don't have shareholders, we don't have member owners, but there is a model of sort of democratic nonprofit. So we are, and it's a process, right? Like we're working to become more and more democratic. We are a staff of 4 full-time and a couple of half-time. My co-executive director is Amaha Selassie, who's a sociologist and community organizer and leader. We have a flat hierarchy, so we actually have staff councils that make most decisions. We use a method called sociocracy, which I could get into, but essentially is a way to make decisions without having, it's neither majoritarian nor is it consent-based. It's sort of somewhere in the middle. We do have a traditional nonprofit board, but the staff really goes to the board with our proposals. So it's very much like a dialogue rather than a top-down. We have a flat pay scale, which is fun. The Mondragon principle is you don't want your top earner to make more than, I think it's like 7 times your bottom earner, but at this point we're all just flat. And then in terms of kind of the community, organizing is our bread and butter. And so Amaha in particular, my co-executive director, comes out of community organizing. I come out of union organizing. So we just, we really believe that there's no shortcuts. You really have to do the work of reaching people where they are. Amaha has been teaching us the sort of asset-based community development framework, the idea that existing in the community, there are gifts and talents that are currently untapped or that aren't necessarily being used up to their full potential, and that through organizing and connecting people with organizations, with even the physical built environment of the city, that you can actually like activate those gifts and talents in a way that unlocks a lot of value that the traditional capitalist market just kind of leaves sitting there. So it's a nice way to think about things, because I think like sometimes in the nonprofit world, we get into this deficit mindset where like we're trying to fix things for the community, or we've identified a problem and we're just going to go in and fix it. And so our model is like people identify what they want to work on, and then we help them activate their own gifts, talents, assets.
That's really inspiring. And honestly, it's exciting to work with Co-op Dayton. I feel like you really do walk the talk, and it's obvious to everyone who works with you that that's the case. So thank you. Thank you for providing that model for the rest of us to try to live up to. We will put contact information, and maybe you would send along some possible articles and books for people to look at, because I do think we don't necessarily have time about the economic survivability of co-ops, but I believe that things like credit unions and public banks and co-ops actually are a lot less stressed by the shocks of change that we have gone through and are likely to go through. So I think it's important to recognize that it's actually a resilient model. And if you would just, or sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Madrigal has survived since the 50s and even came through the 2008 economic crisis and was able to avoid layoffs even after they had one of their co-ops failed in that economic crisis, but they were able to move people around throughout their co-ops to be able to avoid layoffs entirely. So it's really
wonderful. And finally, Lela, would you mind, I know that you are doing some really amazing work, Co-op Dayton is, in terms of business succession, and then also teaching other people about starting co-ops. So maybe you could just speak briefly about that and let people know how they can get involved and also become a member of Gem City Market, because it's a great way to support your work.
Absolutely. Well, the best way to find out about what we're doing right now is on Facebook. So we do, and all our events are on Facebook. Our website is coopdayton.org. We are right now really actively looking for business owners in the region who are interested in exiting their business in the next 5 years and want to think about succession planning with employee ownership as a potential option. So we know, a lot of local business owners are reaching retirement age and may not have a traditional buyer or a traditional successor within their family. Sale to your employees is a great way to preserve your legacy and keep your business going. We also have a co-op and social enterprise incubator that will be starting later this year. And that's for groups of people who have an idea for a business who want to come together. We do everything from traditional business planning to kind of visioning and cooperative governance. It's a cohort model. And the Gem City Market, you can become a member owner at gemcitymarket.com. You can either, if you think you're going to shop at the store, you can become a traditional member owner, or if you just love what we're doing and you want to support us, you can become a supporter owner. And both of those are available on our website.
Great. Thank you so much, Lela. We really appreciate all the work you do. You really are an inspiration. You and your team are an inspiration to a lot of people in the region, and we're really grateful. I know it hasn't been the easiest 5 years getting things off the ground, but we're so excited to see things move forward. And I hope everybody who's watching this interview decides to come and shop and become a member of Gem City Market. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lela.
Thanks, Megan.